Hey Axis and Allies players, the Good Captain here. Welcome to my 12th and final video in my series on Axis and Allies Anniversary Edition 1941 setup. For this video I've decided to cover a range of different topics, so this introduction will act as an agenda for the rest of the video, and I'm also going to place timestamps in the description box below for each subject. So the first subject I want to cover is two aspects in this video series where I was factually wrong. Now they're very subtle inaccuracies, so there's nothing so egregious that I need to pull the video, but in order to be complete and thorough, I want to highlight these two areas in this series. After this, I'm going to resume myself very quickly. This is something I did in the first video. It's also something I did in the first strategic video. That was the Germany video, and it's something I'm going to do in this video. Next, I'm going to be discussing balance and bidding for this version of Axis and Allies. And this is what I consider to be the core subject of this video. Next, I'm going to be discussing some Q&As. Most Q&As I took care of in the comments sections below the videos, but these I feel strongly enough about that I wanted to demonstrate some things using the board. And lastly, I'd like to use this platform, however meager it is, to give some well-earned shout-outs to some of the players and people who supported me throughout this project. Doing something like this takes way more work than the 15 or 20 minutes it takes to cut each video. A lot of people contributed to helping make this video series what it is. And so shout outs are in order, and I'll be doing that at the end of this video. Okay, with that out of the way, the first topic of discussion is where I was wrong. So there were two videos in this series that had minor errors that I'm gonna try to fix right now. And the first error occurred in the national objectives video, specifically for the first German national objective. If you go back to that video, I say that Germany gets 5 IPCs if they control France, Northwestern Europe, and Germany. I must have thought there was a period and not a comma because it's also Czech-Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland that need to be controlled as well. So that's essentially all the major territories of the German Empire except for Norway, Finland, and Morocco, Algeria. The next error was in the optional rules video covering strategic bombing raids for fighter escorts and interceptors. I stated in that video that when the AA guns fire, they hit all escorts and interceptors with a bunch of dice, and then the attacker gets to allocate the hits. In other words, you could take fighter hits before taking bomber hits. But this is clearly not true. What you need to do is roll 2 separate colored dice. You roll for hits on the fighters with 1 colored die, and then you roll for hits on the bombers with a different color. So in that video I was able to edit out the error so it's less confusing, but I want to state here and now that's where I was wrong. Those are the corrections, and I've made edits in the description boxes below each of those videos. So the next topic of discussion is my resume. I think it's important to go over this one more time before I start talking about balance and bidding, because I'm going to be talking about balance and bidding. So I've played probably more than 50 games of Axis and Allies Anniversary 1941 straight up out of box without a bid. I've played these games primarily online, but I've played a good deal face-to-face in tournaments, even a few YouTube games. So if that doesn't add to my credibility, I hope that at least it helps curate the comments section. Another reason I'm doing this is because I feel like if you're going to make this kind of statements I'm going to make about this game with regards to purchasing, overall strategy, and especially with regards to balance and bidding, you should be upfront about your experience with the game. Okay, so with that out of the way, now let's get to the fun part of the video, a discussion on balance and bidding in Axis and Allies Anniversary Edition 1941 setup. But to do this, I'm going to have to turn the camera away from me and aim it towards the board. So I will orient everyone to what I have out here on this board, but I want to take a moment and put my assertion up front. So if you've watched this series, you've heard me say at least a few times that there is an imbalance in this game and that it favors the Axis. Online players, generally speaking, understand this to be true. So for many of us, this is not news. What I'm going to try to do in this segment is demonstrate where that is and why that is, which brings me to this board setup that I have. What I have out here on the board is what I consider to be a fairly conservative projection of Axis and Allied expansion. So, for example, it's totally reasonable and can be expected for the Allies to take Morocco and Libya, as well as Norway and Finland. It's also totally reasonable and expected that Germany will take everything from the Baltic states and the Ukraine, and probably these territories by game turn 5 won't change hands. And the same is true for this swath of Japanese territories over here. A competent Japanese player, even playing a competent Allied player, will very likely secure all of the Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, including India, Madagascar, and at least 5 IPCs of Russia. I'll get into why I have these roundels over the Chinese IPC values, but I really need to ram this point home. This is a very reasonable look for round 4 or round 5 between competent Axis and Allied players. So with that assertion out of the way, we'll proceed now with why I have these roundels covering the Chinese IPC values. So the Chinese IPC values are only relevant if you're an Axis player. The Allies only receive anything from Chinese territories if China has control over at least 2 of their territories at the beginning of their turn. And there are so many restrictions on what you get, where you can place it, and where the units that you do get are allowed to move, that they can essentially be written off for the Allied player. China exists to be taken over by the Axis. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's start talking numbers. This part of the segment may seem a little dry, but I've got to get this out there, so I will move through this as interestingly and as quickly as I can. The first thing we want to touch on is the board economy. How many IPCs are available to both sides? We're going to exclude China, again, for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Those IPCs are only available to the Axis. But how many IPCs are there available to both sides? And the answer to that is there's 166 IPCs, not including China. Of course, I will include China here in a moment, but for now, it's important to understand there are 166 IPCs on this board that both sides have access to. And as I've delineated, all of the roundels represent attainable and sustainable objectives for all the powers. So the next most reasonable question to ask is, what is the value of Japan? What's the value of Germany? What are the values of all of the powers when we get to this point? In other words, who has more of that 166 IPCs? And the answer is pretty interesting. You can do this yourself, but I will say that if the Axis can get to this point, they will have 77 of those 166 IPCs. And the Allies will have 89, which is the remainder. So at first glance, it will seem that the Allies have a bigger piece of the pie, but this is where we add in the big asterisk that is China. The total value of China is 12 IPCs, including Jiangsu and Manchuria. And what is 77 plus 12? Well, it's 89. So when we add in the China factor, the economy seems to be perfectly balanced. In other words, if the Axis can expand to all the areas we have denoted with roundels, and if the Allies can expand to where all the areas they have with roundels, then the economy is perfectly balanced. And that is a hallmark of a good game. So in effect, this is your goal for either side. You want at least half the economy. So the Allies really want to be cranking for Norway and Finland and for Morocco, Algeria, and Libya. Conversely, the Japanese really want to try to hit all of these territories as quickly as they can. Again, by turn 4 or 5, the board, whether you're Allies or Axis, should look close to this. If your side is doing better than this, then good on you. If you're doing worse than this, then you might want to pick it up because it means the economy is not in your favor. So the conclusion here is that there's not any detectable imbalance with regard to the board economy. This is remarkably well balanced. So I'll just take a moment and pay tribute to the developers of this game. Well done and good job creating at least an economic balance or a potential economic balance in Axis and Allies Anniversary Edition. Economic balance is extraordinarily important in games of Axis and Allies. It's, in my opinion, the root cause of most imbalances in these games, and this one seems to have probably the best in the canon series. So now that I've got that out of the way, I'm going to cut straight to where I think the imbalance is. And where this game appears to show its imbalance is right at this point. right when the Axis have captured all of these territories, and even as the Allies have captured those territories, the game begins to disclose an imbalance. And the truth of the matter is, there is just more opportunity for the Axis to gain more IPCs at this point in the game than the Allies have opportunities to gain more IPCs. I like to summarize this in one word, and that is initiative. The Axis maintain an initiative at this point in the game that the Allies struggle to rise to. Some examples of this are the situation in the Indian Ocean. A competent Japanese player will essentially relocate their navy to this area of the board, and then possibly in cooperation with the Italian navy that hopefully has escaped out of the Mediterranean, solidify their hold in this ocean, and then start committing raids up and down the African coast. At the very least, they can conduct raids. At the very worst, they can actually occupy and hold territories, possibly even building an industrial complex in the Union of South Africa, which would be terrible for the Allies. Also in the center of the board, if or when the Japanese break down any Qinghai defense, they have immediate access to 2 IPC value territories that the Russians will find difficult to hold when they're also holding back the German hordes in the west. Another example is with regards to transport supply lines. If you build an industrial complex in the East Indies and in India, those Japanese transports can find it trivially easy to decide to hit Egypt, Anglo-Egypt, Sudan, anywhere up and down the coast. Whereas in contrast, both the British and the American transport shucks are much more canalized. The British, generally speaking, are shucking between sea zones 3 and 4, and the Americans between 9 and 12. It's not that there's no opportunities to hit West Europe or Italy as the Americans, it's just that doing so takes out quite a bit from that floating bridge that you've created. Otherwise, I struggle to find any example of where the Allies can gain ground in this situation. Yes, the green wave will be coming through Egypt and Transjordan by turn 5 to help blunt the Japanese attack. But again, it's difficult to manage Australia and have the Russians hold out in Novosibirsk and Kazakh. There's just a little bit too much kinetic energy on the side of the Axis when it gets to the mid-game as opposed to the Allies, and that's my argument as to why there is an imbalance. It may seem slight, but as the Allied player, you will be acutely aware of this when you get to turns 6 or 7 at the latest. So before I move to a discussion on bidding, I want to sort of wrap this up. This was my argument as to why there's an imbalance in this game. In a very quick recap, first I described why my board looks this way with the roundels, and that is because by turn 4 or 5, we can expect the board to look like this between competent Axis and Allied players. I then moved to a discussion about what the economy looks like in this game, namely that even by turn 4 or 5 and when the board looks like this, there's actually a remarkable balance in the economy. And then I closed this segment by making a pitch for why there's still an imbalance, namely that the initiative remains with the Axis and the Allies have very little, if any, initiative to play. And I did my best to support this argument via examples, namely that raids along the African coast are very possible and easy to do as the Japanese, as well as moving into the USSR, the resource-rich areas east of Russia. At any rate, if you accept that argument, but even if you don't and still feel that the Axis have an advantage, I'm now going to go through a brief argument on bidding. In other words, if we accept that there's an imbalance, where can we most effectively place pieces to correct for that imbalance? So if you feel as I feel in that the Axis and Allies Anniversary Edition 1941 setup is at least slightly in favor of the Axis, then here's my argument for unit placements, also known as bidding. And my argument stems from where the weakest points in the Allied wall are at the beginning of the game. And far and away, the weakest point of the Allies at the beginning of the game is Egypt. Egypt has a very underpowered army that Germany can knock out with a 74 or 75% reliability rate on the G1 attack if it decides to do so. I think that this may have actually been an oversight on the part of the developers. Not to get off on too much of a tangent, but surely they didn't mean to have the Germans have such a high probability of securing Egypt. It seems fairly ahistorical at the very least. The second and third order effects from this are that even if one German tank survives, they can run amok for at least a turn or two in the middle of Africa, pulling off more IPCs for the Axis and giving a headache to the Allies. So in my strong opinion, I think that a setup correction is in order. I wouldn't even call this a bid. I think the game plays much, much better and much nicer if the British have one more infantry added into their defenses of Egypt. Why am I saying this? That's because if you run the battle calculator on this, it turns the odds down from something like a mid-70% chance of success in the G1 attack to, I think it's just over 50% as the Germans. This is not low enough to preclude the attack. A German player might still be incentivized to move against Egypt just to clear those very vital Allied units out of the middle of the board in the beginning of the game. In either case, it's not a complete certainty, and it's much less probable that the Germans will survive with that tank remaining that can go in there and do all the damage that it does in later turns. So I would definitely say the Allies could stand to benefit with this mild setup adjustment. This is very mild. I know online players are probably ripping their hair out by saying I'm undergunning the Allies here and the British probably need 2 infantry in Egypt, and that may be true. But at the very least, I think we can all agree that the British need at least 1 more infantry in Egypt. So if I had a +3 bid, that's where I would place it. And that's where I think you should place it too if you have at least a +3 bid. And though that would help a lot, you could go, I think, as high as 6. And if you had a +4 or 5 IPC bid, I would put the extra 2 IPCs in the UK money pile. That gives them a little more flexibility when it comes to the UK turn 1 to buy other units. But I don't think 6 is a crazy bid either. And if we had 6, there's a strong argument to simply add yet another British infantry into Egypt. Another British infantry would turn that 50-50 battle now into a 25% chance of German success. And that really would more or less effectively turn down the German attack into Egypt to a probably not. In other words, an experienced player most of the time probably would not engage in that battle. But for my money, there is one other area that I think is a weak point, and that is Yunnan. So if I had a +6 IPC bid, this is where I would place my 2nd infantry, right into Yunnan. Now, why am I saying that? The better online opponents that I played against used Japan to hit Yunnan and destroy all the Chinese pieces on the first turn. It seemed to be a goal of theirs. And when all the Chinese pieces are destroyed and China starts its first turn with only 3 territories, it cannot do anything except build 1 infantry, which 99% of the time is placed in Qinghai. This makes this area of the board extraordinarily weak for the Allies. And this is, again, in my opinion, this is a critical part of the board. An effective defense can be raised here, but not so much if the Flying Tigers unit and all the infantries are destroyed on the first round. So I want to wrap up this discussion on bidding by reporting on the bids that I've seen discussed and played with in the online games. So on the forums as of this date, the least bid I've seen for Axis and Allies Anniversary Edition 1941 setup is 9. So when I'm saying +6, it's a conservative 6. And the highest I've seen is in the low 20s, 21, 22. So one frustrating asterisk to this is that most players discussing it on the forums will not delineate between if they're using national objectives or not. So obviously, if you're using national objectives, the bid for the Allies is going to be much higher. We'll now move to Q&A. So the first question I decided to answer in video format is, why don't you believe in building a German aircraft carrier on the first turn and placing it in C-Zone 5? So to answer this question in its entirety, I'm going to steelman the argument from the other side. So why do some people think it's a good idea to build an aircraft carrier in C-Zone 5? Well, right out of the gate, it seems intuitive that you would want to protect this rather valuable, or what people think are valuable, German cruiser and German transport. These units are given to you at the beginning of the game. They're both very useful. Cruiser can offshore, transport can move 2 units across to Norway and Finland, and therefore you can project some dead zone power into these seemingly valuable territories to the north. And perhaps a second or third order effect some players might be hoping for is that the UK leaves themselves open to invasion, which is just not going to happen in this version of the game. Or perhaps they think they might have a shot at naval domination, which is also not going to happen in this game. But let's just stick with the local reasons. Preserving these two units and projecting your power into Finland and Norway for as long as possible. All right, now here's why I feel very strongly you should never make this move as Germany. First and foremost, you are spending 14 IPCs and placing it into an area of the board that really doesn't produce anything for you. You might make the argument, yeah, but we're going to project our power into Finland and Norway, but I just want to hammer this home. You're spending 14 IPCs on a unit that is not going to affect Russia. You're taking pressure off of Russia on the very first turn. The UK player should be looking for opportunities to assist Russia in any way possible, and Germany has done everyone a big favor by spending money not on the Russians. The next chain in logic is a submarine response purchase by the UK. If the Germans did not build a destroyer along with that aircraft carrier, then the British should build at least one, and I highly recommend 2 submarines, because 2 submarines cannot be destroyed in any way. And if the Germans don't response purchase a destroyer on G2, those 2 subs have a 50-50 shot of destroying all of those boats on the UK's next turn. And why do I say 50-50? Because 2 subs with their first strike ability ignore those aircraft without a destroyer, fight only that cruiser and that aircraft carrier, and the first strike makes that battle a 50-50. It's a toss-up. So yeah, the Germans are going to have to response purchase a destroyer if they want to keep that 14 IPC investment they made. Long story short, this turns into an arms race that just saps Germany's strength. It is not worth the extra turn, possibly 2 turns, of collecting a measly 5 IPCs. That's pretty much it. I've done this strategy, I think, twice. I've never seen anyone else do it online, which says something in and of itself, I think. But anyway, that's why I don't think you should build a German aircraft carrier. The next question that I got that I wanted to respond to in this video was, what would you do to fix the national objectives in this game to make it more balanced, to make it more fair for the Allies? So just as a reminder, I did a whole video on the national objectives where I tried to demonstrate the built-in imbalance of this silly optional rule. So let me just say before I give my answer to this question, I feel strongly you should just dump this optional rule. Just never play with it. It's a much more interesting and fascinating game when you don't have this. Okay, with that out of the way, how would I fix this? Okay, the very first thing I would do is everything after the word IPCs and before the word if should just be deleted. It should say gain 5 IPCs if the Soviets control Archangel. And the only other thing that I would do to fix this is to reduce the axis, all axis national objectives down to 3 IPCs or even 2 IPCs. I would lean more towards 3 at first to see if that helps balance it out, but it's way too much money for how easy they all are to collect on. So the next question is, what do I think of the 41 setup compared to the 42 setup? And I really can't say very much about this. I've played maybe 6 to 10 full games of 1942 compared to 1941, so my experience with 41, I would say at this point, is vast. My experience with 42 is about 1/5 as much as my experience with 41. But one thing I can say categorically that is better for the Allies in 42 as opposed to 41 is the turn order. Making Japan go first means that the Russian player can actually assist the Chinese directly. So whatever Japan takes from China, the Russians immediately get a say in what the Chinese are able to take back, right? So if you had a Qinghai defense and you managed to secure Ningxia, well, you are going to get a Chinese infantry that turn. In the 41 setup, it's the inverse. No matter what the Soviets take over for the Chinese, the Japanese immediately get a say in whether that happens or not. So I like that. I really do think that's much better. The only other thing I might say is that the map is the same, so the pressure points I imagine are fairly similar. It's just the opening moves and the ideal things you would want to do in the first couple of turns that are probably a little bit different. So it's an incomplete answer, but that's the best I can give at this date and time. Okay, and the last question, how do I feel about Axis and Allies Anniversary compared to the other versions? I could do a 10-minute response video to this question, but I'll try to condense it here into about a minute and a half. I feel very experienced when I play Global, and I feel like I'm an expert at Classic, and I probably rate myself as an expert or nearly expert at Anniversary 41 now. When I first started playing this game and grinding through all those optional rules, it was probably the most frustrating experience I've had in Axis and Allies. The optional rules in this game are so flabbergasting. It was really irritating to have to play games with tech dice, play games with the national objectives, just to uncover how brutal the effect those rules have on the game. So I had something of a bitter taste in my mouth, but once I got through the woods on that, once I feel like I calibrated the optional rules most optimally, and finally found an out-of-box, no-bid version of 41 that was worth playing, yeah, it became enjoyable. Now, that being said, when I compare this to Classic, I will say that my turns take longer. I feel like my brain is doing more mental push-ups in this game than it does when I play something like Classic. And yet the dopamine hit that I get is the same. So I'm doing more work for the same dopamine hit, but when I play Classic, I don't have to spend nearly as much time on my turns as when I do when I play Anniversary. So in general, what I'm saying is I have mixed feelings about all the extra chrome added into this game when I compare it to Classic. But in terms of balance, for once, it seems like all the chatter on the forums and between players in different playgroups was right. This appears to be probably the most balanced game. However, you can have a terrifyingly crummy experience if you don't calibrate the optional rules right, or at least get your bids down right if you would like to use certain optional rules. So I'm going to turn the camera back around. I'm going to take a quick moment to do some shout outs, and then I'm going to close this video. Okay, it's in this final segment of the video that I would like to take a moment and give some shout outs to a few of the .org players that I played against. Specifically, I have two teams that I want to give a lot of credit to. I could not have done this 12-part series without the help of all of the .org members that I either played by email or played by forum with. But these two teams in particular were extraordinarily influential. So first up is Captain Napalm and Colonel Sanders. That's the handles that they go by on the .org website. And these two fellows were the first two that I ran into on that website that clearly knew their stuff. And what I can say about them is, or what I'll say about Axis and Allies in general, is if you're new to a game and you're going to get your butt kicked, it's best to get your butt kicked by experts. And these two guys, I think, still probably rank to me as the better Axis and Allies Anniversary players that I've run into on the .org website. Just in general, all around exceptional players. And the other team that I want to give a shout out to is the trio, actually. It's Hanswurst, Ozymandiak, and Lederhosen Macht Free. And these guys are very good players, no doubt, but they also have a different playing philosophy, one that I've never run into in Classic, in this game, or really in any playing style of Axis and Allies. And that is, I think, best summed up as follows. If you set up a defense that the attacker has like a 30% chance of success on, they are liable to attack it and take that 30% chance. Not all the time, but they do it enough that you, as their opponent, are constantly scratching your head, rubbing your face like that, wondering, oh my God, are these guys going to do this or not? Because they certainly did that enough in the game that I actually engaged with them afterwards to discuss this, and that's actually their playing philosophy, that risk is part of Axis and Allies. And so the calculator be damned, just doing that is worth it for its own sake. The payoff will either be huge, you can always retreat. At the very least, you'll instill in your opponents the fear that, my God, these people are crazy, and they might actually attack that at a disadvantage, and they might win. Do I really want to do that? So it was really interesting playing those three guys. So those are the shout outs I wanted to give. There are a great many more opponents that I could give shout outs to, but I wanted to highlight those two teams because they were by far the most influential. At any rate, this concludes not only this video, but this series. So in the comments section below, let me know what you thought about this 12-part series. Also, let me know what you think about bidding and balance in the Anniversary 41 setup. And just let me know what you think about Anniversary as it compares to any of the other versions in the canon. I'm really interested to hear what you all have to say. If you've stayed with me through this series, thank you for being patient. I know it takes some time to get these videos out. Just understand that I am a player of Axis and Allies First, and I really try to make sure that what I say in these videos is as accurate as possible before I release them, so it takes a lot of time to kind of put them together. At any rate, thank you for watching this. All the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.